Hello everyone and welcome to my Y&R Trends channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The late afternoon sun dipped behind the Newman Tower, its golden light spilling across the Chancellor Mansion's marble floors. Jill Abbott stood alone in the grand hallway, her reflection wavering in the tall glass doors like a ghost from another life. She had been pacing for over an hour, clutching a sealed envelope, one she had found buried in the back of Philip Chancellor's old desk. It was addressed in a shaky, familiar hand. To Jill. Open only if you're ready to destroy everything. Her heart had nearly stopped when she saw the signature. Genevieve Atkinson. The name was a wound that never healed. Kane's mother. Or so everyone had believed. But why would Genevieve send Jill something so cryptic, so dangerous? Jill's mind spun with memories. Kane's arrival in Genoa City, his charm, his secrets, his desperate need for family. Over the years she had come to love him like a son. But now, with this letter in her hand, that love trembled under the weight of something darker. Jill took a long breath and broke the seal. Inside was a single page, yellowed at the edges, written in Genevieve's elegant but hurried script. Jill, if you're reading this, then the truth has finally clawed its way out. Kane's real parents are not who you think. The life we built, the lies we told, it was all to protect him. The truth is, Kane was never mine. He is the son of Diane Jenkins and Victor Newman. The words blurred as Jill's breath hitched. She dropped into the nearest chair, her trembling hands gripping the letter so tightly it crinkled. No, that can't be, she whispered. Victor? Diane. Her mind replayed years of tangled family drama. Diane's supposed death, Victor's endless affairs, the corporate wars between Newman, Abbott, and Chancellor. But how could Kane, sweet, loyal Kane, be their son? She rose, pacing again, the sound of her heels echoing like thunder through the empty mansion. The thought made her stomach twist. Diane and Victor, two of the most manipulative people Genoa City had ever known, had a son out there who didn't even know who he was. And Jill, of all people, was the one who'd uncovered the secret. The door creaked open behind her. Catherine's old portrait seemed to watch as a familiar voice cut through the silence. Jill, what are you doing in here? It was Billy Abbott, his tone sharp with curiosity. She spun around, the letter half hidden in her hand. Nothing you need to worry about, Billy. Billy raised an eyebrow. That's your lying face, Mom. You've got that. I just found a bombshell that could ruin lives. Look again. Don't be ridiculous, Jill snapped, but her voice betrayed her. Billy stepped closer, his eyes darting to the letter. Is that from Genevieve? Jill hesitated, then sighed. Yes. And it's about Kane. Billy frowned. What about him? She swallowed hard. You can't tell anyone, not yet. I need to be sure. I need proof. But Billy wasn't the kind of man to walk away from a hint of scandal. Mom, you're shaking. What's going on? Jill turned away, gazing at the fire that had burned low in the marble hearth. If what this letter says is true, then Kane's entire life is a lie. His mother wasn't Genevieve. His real parents are Diane Jenkins and Victor Newman. Billy's jaw fell open. What the hell did you just say? She pressed a hand to her forehead. You heard me. Victor Newman. The man who thinks he owns everyone and everything, even family. Billy let out a low whistle. So that makes Kane what? Another Newman heir? Oh, this is gonna blow up half the town. Which is exactly why we can't say anything yet, Jill snapped. Not until I find something concrete. But deep down she knew this was real. Genevieve had no reason to lie. Not now, not after all these years. As night fell over Genoa City, Jill sat alone with the letter spread out before her, the firelight flickering across the ink. She could almost hear Genevieve's voice in the wind whispering, "Protect him, Jill. He can't know the truth yet. Not until it's safe." But safe from what? She picked up her phone, scrolling through contacts until she reached one she hadn't called in years. Someone who once owed her a favor, someone who'd worked in the hospital when Diane Jenkins supposedly died. Dr. Ellison, Jill said when the line connected, her voice trembling slightly. I need to ask you about a baby that disappeared the night Diane Jenkins was taken off life support. The silence on the other end stretched long enough to make her pulse quicken. Jill, the doctor finally said, his tone grave. You shouldn't be digging into this. That child was never supposed to be found. Her breath caught. So it's true then. Another pause. Then a whisper. Some secrets are buried for a reason. If Kane really is that boy, then you're about to start a war you can't win. The line went dead. Jill sat frozen, the phone slipping from her hand. She stared into the fire, her reflection flickering in the flames, and she knew there was no turning back. Tomorrow she'd go to Kane. He deserved to know the truth even if it shattered everything. Because in Genoa City, nothing stays buried forever. The next morning came cold and gray, as though the sky itself sensed what was about to unfold. Rain whispered against the windows of the Chancellor Mansion, soft but insistent, the kind of rain that made secrets feel heavier. Jill stood in the sitting room, a cup of untouched coffee cooling in her hand. She hadn't slept. Every hour of the night had been spent replaying the same questions over and over. How could Victor keep something like this hidden? How could Diane, that manipulative, calculating woman, let her own son grow up in someone else's arms? And most importantly, how could Jill tell Kane that his entire life had been a lie? The doorbell rang, sharp and sudden, startling her from her thoughts. She knew that knock, precise, polite, but with an undercurrent of tension. Kane. Jill set the cup down, her hands trembling as she opened the door. "Hey, Mum," Kane said softly, stepping inside with that warm Australian accent that always softened her heart. "You sounded urgent on the phone. Is everything all right?" For a moment, Jill just looked at him, the man who had called her Mum for years, who had stood by her through family wars and business betrayals. The thought of taking that sense of belonging from him made her chest ache. "Come in, sweetheart," she said finally, her voice low. "We need to talk." He followed her into the living room, glancing around at the flickering fire and half-empty glass of wine on the table. "You've been up all night, haven't you?" "Something like that," she muttered, motioning for him to sit. She hesitated before taking her own seat across from him. "Kane, I found something yesterday. Something that changes everything." Kane frowned. "What do you mean?" She pulled the letter from her pocket, the paper now creased from being read and reread. "It's from Genevieve." He went still. "My mother." Jill swallowed hard. "Yes, but, Kane, this letter says she wasn't your mother. Not biologically." The color drained from his face. "What?" "She says she raised you to protect you," Jill continued, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "But your real parents are Diane Jenkins and Victor Newman." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. The rain outside grew louder, tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. Kane shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. "That's not possible. Diane's dead. And Victor, he would have known." "I know how it sounds," Jill said quickly, her words tumbling out. "But Genevieve wouldn't lie about this, not after all these years. She wanted to protect you, Kane. I think she was afraid of what Victor would do if the truth ever came out." He rose from his chair, pacing in front of the fireplace. No, this doesn't make sense. Victor Newman doesn't just forget he has a child. He would have used me, manipulated me, tried to control me. It's what he does." Jill's eyes softened. Maybe he didn't know. Or maybe he knew and made sure no one else ever found out. "You know how far Victor will go to protect his image, his legacy." Kane turned toward her, his jaw tight. "And Diane? She's been dead for years. Why wouldn't she say anything?" "Maybe she couldn't," Jill whispered. "Genevieve's letter mentioned danger. Maybe Diane was threatened. Maybe she was silenced before she could tell anyone the truth." Kane ran a hand through his hair, his expression a mix of disbelief and fury. "You're asking me to believe that my whole life, my entire identity was built on lies? That Genevieve kidnapped me from a hospital and raised me as her own to protect me?" Tears welled in Jill's eyes. "I wish I could tell you it wasn't true, but I checked, Kane. I called Dr. Ellison. He was there that night when Diane supposedly died. There was a baby that went missing, and the file was buried." Kane's voice cracked. "You checked?" "I had to," Jill said, her voice breaking. "Because if this is true, then you deserve to know who you are. You deserve to know the truth about your family." He turned away, staring out at the rain. The reflection of the fire shimmered in his eyes, like a storm barely contained. "You should have left it alone, Jill." The way he said her name, Jill, not Mom, felt like a knife. Kane. He shook his head. Do you have any idea what this means? Victor Newman is the last person I ever wanted to be connected to. And Diane, she was ruthless, manipulative. I don't want to believe that blood runs through me. Jill rose and took a hesitant step toward him. Blood doesn't define you, Kane. You're not them. You never were. He turned, his voice low and raw. Then why do I feel like my whole life's been stolen from me? She had no answer. The fire crackled, filling the silence between them. Finally, Kane took a deep breath, his expression hardening. If Victor Newman is my father, I'm going to find out from him, face to face. Kane, don't, Jill warned. He'll deny it, twist it, use it against you. That's what he does. Then let him try, Kane said, his tone sharp. Because if he's lied about this, I'll make sure the whole world knows. No more secrets. He grabbed his coat and headed for the door. Jill followed, desperate. Kane, please think about this. You're angry. You can't just confront Victor without proof. He stopped at the threshold, turning back to her with eyes full of betrayal. You should have told me sooner. You should have trusted me. Then he was gone, the door slamming behind him. Jill stood frozen, staring at the rain where he'd disappeared. The letter felt heavy in her pocket again, like a curse. She sank into the chair by the fire, pressing her hands to her face. God help him, she whispered. Because once Victor finds out, everything will burn. Across town, in the towering glass office of Newman Enterprises, Victor Newman sat behind his desk, reviewing a stack of merger documents. The storm outside rattled the windows, but his expression remained calm, unreadable. A knock came at the door. Come in, Victor said without looking up. The door opened and Kane stepped inside, rain dripping from his coat, eyes blazing with fury. Victor looked up, his brow furrowing. Kane, to what do I owe this surprise? Kane's voice was steady but dangerous. I think you already know, Victor. Victor leaned back in his chair, studying him. Do I? Kane stepped closer, slamming Genevieve's letter on the desk. You're my father. And you've been lying about it for decades. Victor's expression didn't change, but for a brief, flickering moment, something dark and knowing passed through his eyes. Who told you that? He asked softly. Kane's jaw tightened. Doesn't matter. I want the truth. Victor rose slowly, his powerful presence filling the room. Be careful what you ask for, son. Because once you hear it, there's no going back. Kane's heart pounded. Then tell me. Victor paused, and for the first time in a long time, the great Victor Newman looked uncertain. The room seemed to hold its breath, the very air thickening until it was difficult to inhale. Jill had not intended for the conversation to take this turn, not really. They had been discussing business, the perpetual power struggles of Chancellor Winters, a familiar dance of corporate intrigue and personal grudges. But something had shifted, a raw nerve exposed by a careless comment, a flicker of old pain in Victor's eyes that had ignited a long smoldering fury in Jill's. It was a fury born not of recent skirmishes, but of decades of silence, of a secret so profound and so carefully buried that its very existence had become a geological layer in the foundation of all their lives. The words once released could not be taken back. They hung between them not as a simple statement of fact, but as a seismic event that had just reshaped the entire landscape of the past, present, and future. You always did think you could bury your mistakes, Victor, under money and power and threats. But you can't bury this. You can't bury him. Kane's parents are Diane and Victor. For a moment there was only silence, a void of sound so complete it was deafening. Victor Newman, the titan of industry who had faced down corporate raiders, assassins, and every manner of adversary, simply stared, his famous composure cracking like thin ice. The name Diane Jenkins was a ghost. A specter he had personally exorcised from his narrative long ago. To have her conjured now, in this context, was not just an attack. It was a desecration of the history he had so meticulously curated. His mind, usually a whirlwind of strategies and countermoves, went blank, then raced backwards through the years, through a haze of old affairs and complicated entanglements. Diane. Beautiful, volatile, treacherous Diane. Their liaison had been a brief, incendiary chapter, one of many in his long life, but he had sealed it shut, convinced it held no lasting consequences beyond the usual bitterness and betrayal. The idea that it had produced a son, a living, breathing man who had been walking in and out of his orbit for years, was an impossibility. It was a lie. It had to be a lie concocted by Jill to wound him where he was most vulnerable. His legacy. But Jill's expression held no triumph, only a grim, weary resolve. This was not a spoiler delivered for dramatic effect. It was a confession, a burden she had carried for far too long. She saw the denial in his eyes, the furious disbelief, and she pressed on, her voice low and steady, forcing him to listen, to remember. She spoke of a time of great turmoil, when Victor's empire was under threat and his marriage to Nikki was in one of its many fragile states. Diane, always an opportunist, saw her opening. Their affair was intense and, like all things involving Diane, dangerously complicated. When she discovered she was pregnant, it was not a cause for celebration but a weapon. Victor, embroiled in other battles and viewing Diane as an unstable liability, refused to acknowledge the child as his. He offered money, silence, a discreet disappearance. He built a fortress of denial, using his power to ensure the story never saw the light of day. Diane, enraged and cornered, became a phantom, her pregnancy a secret she carried like a bomb. The child, a boy, was born into a world of shadows and secrets. Jill, who had her own complicated history with both Diane and the tangled web of Genoa City's elite, found herself drawn into the drama, first as a reluctant confidant, then as a keeper of the truth. She described Diane's desperation, her attempts to use the baby as leverage, and her ultimate, devastating decision. Believing she could not provide for the child and unwilling to let Victor simply write him out of existence, she made a heartbreaking choice. She gave the baby up for adoption, ensuring he was placed with a family far away from the toxic battleground of Genoa City, a family who would name him Cain. And with that act, the secret was sealed. Diane retreated, the wound of her loss festering into the bitterness that would come to define her later years, and Victor, believing the matter closed, turned his attention back to his empire and his acknowledged family. The past was buried, or so they thought. The name Cain landed in the quiet room with the force of a physical blow. This was no longer an abstract story about a long-lost infant. This was about a man they all knew. Cain. The man who had arrived in Genoa City as an enigma, a polished British-accented executive with a mysterious past. The man who had fallen in love with Lily Winters, Jill's own granddaughter, becoming a son-in-law in all but name. The man who had been a father figure to her great-grandchildren, a CEO at Chancellor Winters, a fixture at family dinners and holiday gatherings. Victor's mind reeled, connecting the dots with a dawning, horrifying clarity. The physical resemblance he had occasionally noted and dismissed as coincidence, the set of the jaw, the intensity of the gaze, now seemed glaringly obvious. The shared traits of ruthless determination and a deep-seated need for family, traits Victor saw in himself and his children, were there in Cain, had always been there. He had been mentoring, battling, and coexisting with his own son for years, completely blind to the truth. The implications began to unfurl, each one more devastating than the last. This revelation rewrote everything. It rewrote Cain's entire identity, a man who had already grappled with so much deception about his origins. He had believed himself to be the son of an Australian criminal, had taken on the name Cain Ashby, as part of a different deception altogether. His life had been a series of assumed identities and hidden truths, and now the foundational lie upon which he had built his present was itself a lie. The man he was, the man Lily loved, the father he was to his children, all of it was called into question by this single shattering sentence. How would he ever trust a truth again when his entire history was a Russian nesting doll of falsehoods? The quest for self that had defined so much of his adult life was now rendered null and void, sent back to the very beginning. For Victor, the revelation was a cataclysm that struck at the heart of his most cherished ideal, family. The Newman legacy was his religion, his children its acolytes. He had fought, manipulated, and sacrificed everything to build a dynasty, to ensure the Newman name would endure through Victoria, Nick, and Adam. The paternity of his children was a saga in itself, a source of endless drama and conflict, but it was his saga. To learn that another son existed, one conceived in a chapter of his life he had deemed insignificant, one he had rejected and disavowed, was a profound failure. It was a crack in the monument he had built to himself. This was not a young child he could welcome into the fold. This was a grown man with his own history, his own grievances, and his own complicated relationship with the Newman patriarch.